bag in the past week? How many of you threw away a plastic grocery bag? The World Watch Institute estimates that Americans throw away 100 billion plastic grocery bags every year. On an individual level, there's a lot that can be done. The average American household takes home 1,500 plastic grocery bags. We think of plastic bags as an environmental problem because of the trash that it generates. However, if those 1,500 grocery bags were recycled, this would result in 25.5 kilowatt hours of energy savings, enough to power a laptop for 509 hours. When we're talking about less energy use, this obviously also means fewer greenhouse gas emissions. While this might not sound like a huge impact, I found in my experience that climate change is much more compelling as a personal issue than as a global challenge of the distant future. I personally first became interested in environmental issues as a little kid who loved the outdoors. As a second grader, I didn't really understand the science behind climate change, but I did understand that something was wrong with plastic bags strewn across the San Francisco Bay and mountain lions in residential neighborhoods as a result of habitat loss. As I started to learn more about the science, I tried to convince people around me to do something about it, starting with my parents, who were not amused when I dug through the trash looking for recyclables or turned off the lights everywhere, and with my friends, who were equally annoyed when I nagged them all the time about reusing water bottles and biking everywhere. However, I think my intentions and instincts were good. A 2013 study found that 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change has a human cause. However, a 2015 Pew poll found that only 50% of the American public agrees. This represents a huge gap between the experts who are actually studying climate science and public perceptions. I've seen evidence of these statistics in my own life. As a Geosciences major at Princeton, I often saw a huge disconnect between what I was learning in my classes about climate science and the views of my Princeton peers in other academic disciplines, and even my plastic bag shaming neighbors in Palo Alto. This disconnect between scientists and the general public is often just a communication problem. This is a standard graph that is cited as evidence of human contribution to climate change, showing the rising concentrations of CO2 as measured. However, this image of Boston covered in snow this past winter probably resonated a lot more with the general public, and people remembered it better. And this is what first drew me to Climate Central, which is an organization of scientists and journalists. As a science organization, it is really dedicated to scientific integrity, and as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization, it really focuses on reporting the facts without advocating a specific position. But as a journalism organization, it's also really focused on effective communication. At Princeton, I was a certificate student in the public policy school. I learned a lot about the importance of public perceptions. And as a staff writer for our daily newspaper, I really understood that there were a lot of tools you could use for effective communication. But I rarely saw these applied in the classroom as a science major. And I think this is something that makes Climate Central really unique. While climate change is ultimately about rising temperatures, just telling people 2 degrees warmer on average isn't very compelling for most folks. And this is why Climate Central really adopts a local approach. One of its major projects is a collaboration with TV meteorologists. So meteorologists are among the few scientists that the general public interacts with on a fairly regular basis by getting their local weather or climate story on TV. Climate Central works with a team of over 200 TV meteorologists, providing on a weekly basis a locally tailored graphic about climate change and how it's affecting that local city so that the meteorologists can go on air and talk about weather and climate and also talk about climate change. Another example of this is an interactive that I worked on called Winter Loses Its Cool. So for this interactive, we looked at the current number of times on average that cities experience temperatures below freezing. And then we looked at temperature projections based on climate models that were also used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, to show how this number of freezing nights will change by 2100. So for the interactive, you type in your city like Buffalo, New York, and you'll see that it currently experiences on average 124 nights below freezing. But by 2100, it could experience as few as 57 nights below freezing, making it comparable to Charlotte, North Carolina. So just the average warming is probably not something that most people could understand, but by referencing a specific threshold, freezing temperatures, and a specific city, we hope to make this a more local, understandable message. We've also talked about rising temperatures in a number of different ways. For example, city-specific graphs relating concentrations of ozone to high temperatures shows the local air quality impacts of higher temperatures. Similarly, we've also looked at projections for days above 90 compared to current days, again, using a specific temperature threshold that people might recognize better than just average warming. And as a journalism organization, Climate Central has partnerships with a number of major publications, allowing this particular interactive to be featured in The Guardian and The Huffington Post, among other publications. Beyond just looking at climate trends, I've also looked at climate impact trends because ultimately we care about climate change because of its human impacts. One analysis I'm working on right now looks at heat advisory days as defined by the National Weather Service. And these are days where the temperature and humidity combined results in conditions so miserable that it warrants a health hazard. And by looking at census data on vulnerable populations in Pacific cities, including the elderly, the very young, and those living in poverty, we've tried to really tell the local climate story of how warm temperatures really affect the people actually living in those cities. Similarly, we've looked at cooling degree days, or days when the average temperature exceeds the threshold above which people typically turn on their air conditioners, to relate rising temperatures to increased energy demand, as well as, again, looking at populations that have air conditioners to show how this change might affect those who cannot prepare for it. While Climate Central has really focused on taking a local approach, ultimately, to fully address the causes and consequences of climate change, we need to look at the global data. For example, 2014 was, on average, the hottest year across the entire world. But if you live in the Northeast, which is one of the few places that was not particularly hot this year, you might miss this message. And organizations like Climate Central have increasingly been able to take a more global approach as this global data has become available. Ultimately, however, the mission remains unchanged. We're trying to inform the public about climate change and really bring home the local message. I know as a child, I first became interested in environmental issues because I saw the impacts of environmental degradation on my local environment. I think it's very important to take this local approach. And I've really appreciated the nonpartisan, non-advocacy approach that we take at Climate Central because I think the facts truly do speak for themselves. For example, a plastic bag takes 1,000 years to break down, and scientists estimate that every square mile of ocean has 46,000 pieces of floating plastic, resulting in the deaths of 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals every year. Maybe this will make you think twice next time you take a plastic bag while grocery shopping. But even if not, at least it'll be an informed choice. Yeah.